our next speaker, who is Paul Ehrlich. Paul is being Professor Emeritus of Population Studies at Stanford University in the US and the president of the Stanford Center for Conservation Biology. He is a founder of the Millennium Alliance for Humanity and the Biosphere, who are hosting this conference as well. He is a pioneer in alerting the world to the problems linked to human overpopulation and raising issues around population resources and the environment as matters of vital to public policy. And it's a great honor to have him today with us. So here is Paul's explanation on the issues that humanity faces.
It's a great pleasure to be here, although I'm not going to be talking about a particularly pleasurable topic, because what I'd like to do is tell you why knowledgeable scientists are incredibly worried about the future of civilization and what knowledgeable scientists think we might be able to do about it. The basic problem is that humanity is faced with a series of existential threats, things that threaten our ability to maintain a civilization, maybe even in some circumstances to persist as a species. And you're probably familiar with some of those threats. The one that gets the most publicity is, of course, climate disruption. We've recently in the United States had a beautiful example where the warming of the planet, and particularly the differential warming of the Arctic, has led to a weakening of the circumpolar vortex, allowing blobs of cold air from the Arctic to penetrate as far as Texas and cause great problems. And of course, we've also seen in places like Australia and California and Siberia, huge problems created by a general drying of those areas as the climate disruption continues. And the mess in Texas has also illuminated what's wrong with the social system in the United States, because the moronic governor of Texas said the big problem was green energy, when in fact the big problem is in part caused by Texas's overuse of fossil fuels, which is adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, which in turn is warming the planet, which in turn is decreasing the polar equator gradient and leading to the big problems in Texas. So climate disruption is a big issue, although most of the discussion of it doesn't hit what's really important. People think mostly of sea level rise, which is inevitable, is going to be, it's happening now. It's going to be really horrible for people in many of the world's cities, which are right on the seashore. But it's going to be slow enough you'll be able to walk away from it. On the other hand, you can't walk away from all food. And the big problem with climate disruption is, of course, it clobbers agriculture. And anybody, and along with that, it clobbers parts of the agricultural system like pollinators that are extremely important to our diets. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand that. All you have to be is a gardener or a tropical fish enthusiast. And you know, if you don't pay careful attention to the temperature, you end up with dead plants or dead black mollies or angelfish or whatever. Because all the organisms on the planet, including human beings, have evolved to exist at a certain temperature range. And what we're doing is changing that range very, very rapidly. And so one of the prospects is that we're going to become much more marginal in our food supplies if we keep this rapid climate change going. And you probably know that a lot of people are hungry today, that something close to 2 billion of the roughly 8 billion people on the planet are micronutrient malnourished, which among other things weakens their immune systems and allows things like viruses to get going, and you may have heard of that also. So climate disruption is one of the big existential threats. Tied to it is what I just mentioned, is the loss of biodiversity. That is, we are utterly dependent on the other plants, the other animals, and the microorganisms of the planet for our existence, and we are wiping out their populations at a very rapid rate. Catastrophic declines in things we observe, like the number of birds in North America, but also in lots of things we don't observe, which do lots of things for us. That is, for example, the native bees that pollinate a lot of our crops and are disappearing and so on, although the average person doesn't know that they're disappearing. So climate change is one thing. Loss of biodiversity is another existential threat. Toxification of the planet is yet another existential threat, because everybody is getting dosed with a series of synthetic organic chemicals that we use for all sorts of things, most obviously in terms of loss of biodiversity, the silent spring phenomenon. We kill off a lot of organisms by overusing pesticides. We make our own lives much more tricky by misusing antibiotics, and we are using fossil fuels to create plastics, which are now jamming into the ocean, so much so that it's estimated that by the middle of the century, there'll be more plastic in the oceans than fishes. The plastics get ground up into tiny little fragments, get coated with persistent organic pollutants, that is, poisons, which then can enter the human food chain, cross the blood-brain barrier, and you get little bits of poison-coated plastic in your brain. A lot of people think that was the real problem with Trump, but we're not sure. So toxification is a gigantic problem. It might help solve the population problem because human sperm counts are plummeting around the world, but it's not yet clear how far they're going to go or how fast they're going to go. But that is another potential existential problem. We're also losing our soils and groundwater, which are essential to agriculture. There are many, many threats to our entire food system. And the food system contributes in its own way, because somewhere close to a third of the greenhouse gases that are changing the climate that the food system is so dependent upon actually come from running the food system. We use a huge amount of fossil fuel to grow our crops. So we spend a lot of time and energy converting oil into potatoes and doing things like that. So we have a series of really threatening problems beyond the ones that you probably thought of, like the possibility, the likelihood that there are going to be more pandemics. And we've been very lucky with the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, in that the scientific community has come together very rapidly and produced a set of vaccines, which at least at the moment seem to have the potential for doing the job and at least greatly reducing the problems with this new virus. But we're doing all sorts of things like wiping out biodiversity that in complicated ways make the chances of more nasty viruses, more nasty pandemics much larger. You want to always remember that human beings' infectious diseases come from other animals. They're variants in pathogens, viruses, and bacteria and fungi that in most cases are already present in other animals. And as you wipe out the big animals, which we're doing first, so that things like rats become more common, it turns out they're also wonderful transmitters of their own diseases to human beings. And I always remember that my old colleague Josh Lederberg, a great scientist and Nobel laureate who invented sex in bacteria. The bacteria have been grateful ever since, but Josh once said that human survival is not preordained. That's why we have viruses. So something to pay attention to. Hopefully, the Biden administration will restore some of the things that the Trump administration destroyed that are designed to warn us of coming pandemics. The basic cause of all this has been obvious for a very long time. One way to put it is it's the scale of the human enterprise. There are just too many of us. Each one of us, on average, consumes too much, and we use malign technologies in many cases to service that consumption, and we deal with it very unevenly, which creates other problems for us. So population size, overpopulation, overconsumption, inequality, bad choice of technologies and social arrangements have produced a gigantic mess that we have to deal with. That mess is almost brand new in evolutionary terms. In other words, for most of the roughly 300,000 years that modern Homo sapiens, modern people, have been on the planet, we were small group animals living as hunter-gatherers. It wasn't until our population became large enough that people decided to start settling down and practicing agriculture that the real problems started. Agriculture and settling down, among other things, allowed a family to raise more food than it needed, and that led to specialization, to not just farmers and not just hunter-gatherers and farmers, but soldiers, priests, mechanics, scientists, and so on, which allowed us to develop a whole series of technologies, the agricultural revolution, that led then to the Industrial Revolution, which, as you can see in this list of things I've gone over, is really what's responsible for most of the existential threats. Maybe the most serious, of course, and the one that has the greatest potential for ending us as a species is the so-called mutually assured imbecility. That is, the Russians, the Americans, and some other countries having so many nuclear weapons that if they used them, it could alter the climate and the planet so much that humanity might actually die out. Well, that's one of the great triumphs of our two revolutions, our agricultural revolution and our industrial revolution. The agri-revolution also led to economic inequality. When you had to carry everything around with you when you were a hunter-gatherer, it was hard to become super rich. And it also allowed things like slavery, xenophobia, and so on. In a summary, we're basically a small group animal that has developed a way of getting gigantic groups, but we haven't learned how to deal with the gigantic groups. We did fine when there was 50 to 100 people in each group, but subsequently things have really gone downhill. And another major thing is that we evolved our nervous systems to detect rapid changes in our surroundings. If somebody threw a rock at your head, you wanted to be able to detect it against a still background. And you can do a little test for yourself by moving your head rapidly from side to side, and you'll notice the room stays still. If you take the video on your cell phone and do this with it, and then watch the recording, you'll get dizzy because your brain has evolved to get information from nerves that tell you your head is moving, and it keeps the background steady. So that we're very, very good at detecting a car swerving towards us or a handsome person of the opposite gender coming towards you and so on. But we're really lousy at seeing changes in the background because our minds were designed to keep the background steady. And one of the horrors today, of course, is what we need to do is see the gradual changes in the background. We need to see the gradual increase in temperature taken by a thermometer high up on a mountain in Hawaii. We need to register on the increasing numbers of nuclear weapons in various places. The things that threaten us, the toxification and so on, are gradual changes in our background, and we're designed to see rapid changes against a stationary background, and that makes it very, very difficult for us to adjust to the changes we have to make if we're going to survive and keep our civilization going. It's a small group animal just hasn't really adjusted and hasn't faced a lot of things. For example, scientists keep telling people more facts about the environment, but most people don't pay any attention to facts. They come from small groups where what they value is the opinions of their buddies, what the hunt leader says, and so on. They want to be admired by their friends, and the emotions play a huge role in our societies, which tells us that if we're going to change our behavior, which we certainly have to do, we're going to have to do a lot of things like promote soap operas with the right messages and so on, because scientists have proven that expanding on the factual knowledge of people does not normally change their behavior. They've done actual tests taking climate deniers, giving them even more scientific information about the climate. It makes them more solid deniers. And until we face that just producing the science is not going to produce an evidence-based world, we're going to continue to be in trouble, because our basic task to get out of the bind we're in is going to involve another revolution, what I like to call a survival revolution, that will be of the same scale of change in our societies, in our culture, our non-genetic information, as was the Industrial Revolution. There's a lot of things you can do individually to help protect civilization. One of the best, for example, in a rich country like ours, is have one fewer child. Having one fewer child is the equivalent of giving up driving 23 times. So there's a lot you can do individually, but actually the main chore is going to be to do things politically, to, for example, join the mob, mahb.stanford.edu, mahb.stanford.edu. It's a group of citizens trying to get together and find ways to change civil society to make it more possible to preserve our civilization, which a lot of us think would be worth preserving. So the big task is to figure out how to do it. In other words, scientists have really pointed out what needs to be done. We know we have to stop burning fossil fuels very, very fast. We know that we have to stop destroying our soils and overusing our groundwater. We know we have to gradually lower the size of the human population. Do it gradually, do it humanely. We know one of the main ways to do that is to give women equal rights and equal opportunities with men, and give everybody access to modern contraception and backup abortion. We know we have to do those things. We don't know how the hell to get them done. And that's where the social scientists, the artists, the people who are planning TV and so on come in. We're really moving from being in the hands of the biophysical scientists who have told us what the problems are and created many of the problems, to civil society trying to figure out how to get the things done that are going to get us out of this ghastly mess that we're rapidly slipping into. So I hope you will all join the mob, mahb.stanford.edu, and listen to the other people, the wonderful lineup of people that are going to be in this symposium. And I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Well, that was a really inspiring talk from Paul Ehrlich. So now I'm going to be asking Paul a few questions. So Paul, you first published your book, The Population Bomb, in 1968. And you explained in it the consequences of human overpopulation and its side effects on agriculture and the ability of humanity to feed itself. So it's been 53 years, and I wanted to ask you, how do you maintain your drive and keep speaking up for 53 years about a topic which, for the most part, the public doesn't acknowledge as an issue?
Well, a couple things help. One is being a loudmouth, and I don't know whether that was entirely genetic or partly environmental, but also I have a huge advantage over some of my colleagues, for instance, in demography, because what I've had to say has gotten complete and essentially total support from my colleagues. My original work in butterfly evolution and taxonomy, the person who was the leading scientist in that area when I was young, when I was an assistant professor, was a guy named Ernst Mayr, who died a few years ago at 100. And shortly he died. Another was Theodosius Dobzhansky, who was the top geneticist of the last century. And he was gone even longer ago. But Ernst used to send me holographic letters saying, "You're on exactly the right track, keep at it." Dodik was the same. I had no flack from my colleagues. And in fact, many of them signed on to scientists' warnings in the 1930s saying the same thing. Some young demographers now have to be very careful because demography has, at the upper levels, the senior people, has been polluted by what we call daydream believers. That's economists. Most economists think you can grow forever on a finite planet. And young demographers have to be very careful what they say, or their careers will be damaged. So it's been wonderful to have the full-scale support of my colleagues, and a whole bunch of us are still working together to try and get the job done. So I've been very, very fortunate, lucky in my career, particularly because of the support of my colleagues.
That's wonderful. I also noticed that at the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s, overpopulation was flagged as an issue and understood to be an issue by very eminent people, such as, for example, Martin Luther King and others like him. But over time, it has sort of acquired a reputation for being a false issue, something that is a red herring that shouldn't be discussed. So why do you think there was this evolution in the way we collectively think about overpopulation? And do you think the pendulum could swing again? And what would it take for awareness of this issue to come again?
I think the pendulum is beginning to swing back in the other direction already. The reasons are, I think, pretty obvious. First of all, there was great concern about, first of all, let me say, the original title for the population bomb was Population Resources Environment. But the publisher said it'll sell better if you call it Population Bomb. And so I became known as the Population Bomber, even though actually the reason that I emphasize population in the book is that one of my heroes was Rachel Carson. I only met her once, but I was very concerned. My original research when I was studying for my PhD was on the evolution of DDT resistance in fruit flies. And of course, in the population bomb, we talk a lot about that. But then, first of all, there were the racists, which I had hoped we had damped down in this country until at least the Reagan era, but who said, yes, Ehrlich says there's too many people. Here's the kind of people we want to get rid of. And that's something that people concerned with population have had to face for a very long time. Because yeah, there are too many people, but there are not too many poor people. There are too many rich people. And there's not too many people of any given skin color or any different ethnicity. There's just too many people consuming too much. And what we need to do is get everybody to have smaller families and get everybody basically with the same standard of living. That is, you need redistribution, not growth. And that's slowly coming back, but we've had, particularly during the Trump administration and still continuing, a resurgence of hideous racism in our country. And it's been a concern of mine for my entire life. I had my life threatened desegregating restaurants in Lawrence, Kansas by group action when I was a graduate student. And we need even more of that today. And I think if we're going to solve these problems, we need the young people, all of them, to get out there and do things. And I was very pleased, for instance, with the Black Lives Matter movement. You're not going to get the high-level politicians who are entirely owned by the people who donate to them in most cases, to lead the way. We got to get really smart young people, as we have seen in climate, leading the way.
Absolutely. So during your talk, you mentioned a really interesting concept, that it's not possible to convince someone with more data. And you also mentioned that as a species, we have evolved to detect rapid change so that we don't actually see background changes. So it reminded me of Yuval Noah Harari's book, Homo Sapiens, in which he explains that our ability to transition from small bands of hunter-gatherers to large civilization rests on our ability to create what he calls myths and what I'll call narratives. So to change the narrative about who we are and what we are here to accomplish. So change and progress seem to be directly linked to the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves as a species. In what ways do you think you would like to see our narrative change? What stories and myths do we need to create now in order to trigger change?
Well, first of all, Harari picked up the thread very nicely. It's one of the better summary books that I've read on the topics. And I think you can look at the example, for example, you're talking to an old man. What can you expect? But the Population Media Center, run by Bill Ryerson, gives examples of the following sort. They'll go and do a survey in a country about attitudes towards, say, women's rights and abortion. And then they'll run a soap opera for 10 weeks or something, in which it's an exciting soap opera. It tells you a lot of stuff, it keeps you on the edge of your chair, but it also has a theme that emphasizes the directions we think that people's attitudes ought to go. And then they run surveys afterwards, and it finds out that attitudes have changed. And we see the impact. One of the nice examples in my mind of some single picture that changed humanity dramatically was the first picture taken of Earth from outer space. The little blue dot picture, basically, except blown up. And that really brought home to people something that the ecological community had been emphasizing since around 1950, and the whole community, the fact that we're a global society, that we are an isolated single mass, and the kind of big level questions we're going to have to start asking if we're going to move in the right direction is things like, are borders ethical? The resources of the planet are randomly distributed. When you hear lines like, how did our oil get under their sand? You can see that the nation state system is not the way to successfully run an entire planet, which is what we have to do. So I'm blithering on. Ask me another question or pass it on to somebody who knows what they're talking about.
I think, actually, I just made a note. Are borders ethical is a fascinating question. So I must also ask you questions from our participants who are kindly writing them down in the chat. And we have a question from David Barash, who mentions, you explained the concept of humanity being geared, our brains being geared to detect rapid change as opposed to slow moving change. And so David is asking that how do you deal with the two happening together? So he mentions, for example, slow moving disasters such as a global heating, and at the same time, potentially extremely fast change like a nuclear strike. And how do you reconcile the two happening in tandem? And how would we be able to deal with both levels of threat and dedicate our attention to both types of threat and at the different phases they're happening?
In my view, you're doing exactly what needs to be done, but on a much larger scale. That is, questions like, are borders ethical? I think the people who think about it understand that's a really big question. And when you look at what's happening to migration in the United States and what's going to happen, and it's already happening in some places around the world in migration, these are gigantic issues that basically aren't discussed in the public media or in the public. We don't discuss ethics very much at all. Stanford University has a war criminal running one of its big institutions, and nobody seems to worry about that. So we need much more public discussion, which is exactly what this symposium is trying to generate, what the mob tries to generate. People have to start, first of all, scientists know they don't have the answer to many things. And my biggest worry when I was, say, 12 years old was that scientists would discover everything and understand everything before I had a chance to become a scientist. It was the most ridiculous worry I've ever had. We live in a world of uncertainty. Scientists are all very aware of that, but the public doesn't know how to deal with it, and they don't discuss how to deal with it. And it's something that everybody has to decide on. We are stuck with each other. We're stuck with a very large population, much larger than we'll ever be able to sustain over a long term, unless there are miracles in science that the scientists have not thought of yet. But it looks like our knowledge is good enough to know that nobody is going to produce, say, a way of recycling energy, which would demolish one of the most basic laws that have been proven everywhere in the universe. Yeah. What we need is much more discussion, much more people aware of it, changing the curriculum. And for instance, in major universities, if we changed our curricula to deal with the existential threats, that would feed on down to the L-high system, at least in the United States, because most of the problems that are going to be discussed in this symposium are easily understood by middle school students. In other words, the science is not that super special and super complicated. You don't have to know rocket science to know the more people you have producing, the more greenhouse gases, that you're going to have trouble with your agriculture because you're going to change the temperature. And every time you planted plants in your backyard that were tropical and you've had a winter, guess what happens?
Absolutely. So one last question from Ashley Colby, who mentions that she's a former student of your old friend Jean Rosa at Washington State.
Oh, yeah.
She asks, what can you name as small-scale solutions that could be adopted worldwide that really excite you? And she says, actually, there are things that she finds exciting, like, for example, advancing more small-scale agriculture and homesteading, repopulating rural areas. Are there solutions of that type, small-scale solutions that you think are promising and would be good to apply?
There are all kinds of small-scale solutions that we can all take part in. Little economic systems like giving loans to women in poor countries. Turns out women are smarter than men and very able to do wonderful things with a little bit of financial support. That's a small solution, and there are all kinds of small solutions. Eating less meat is a small solution. Not doing more walking and less driving is a small solution. But the thing that we have to remember is The level of small solutions give us clues about what ways we could go and what ways we can change our behavior. But in the decade or so that we may have left to really do something, at the very top of the list has to be political action. It's collective action is the way to go. But small solutions can make your own life better, and small solutions can actually move things more rapidly in the right direction. I mean, for example, I have discovered that drinking fermented grape juice keeps my internal environment in great shape while I consider what's happening to the external environment. I think 45 Mouton is the best of those in grape juices you can try.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Paul. It was a pleasure to have you. And thank you so much for all the work you're doing to save humanity from itself.